Hi there, my name is Peter Betts. I'm a Professor of Tectonics and Structural Geophysics at Monash University, and today I'm going to talk about how regional geophysical data has reshaped our tectonic analysis of the Australian continent. I'd like to acknowledge some of my collaborators, Robin Arment, Lauren Allier from Monash University, Carolyn Tiddy from University of South Australia, Mark Jessel, plus the various other people listed in the title slide who have contributed to the various programs of research that have helped us to understand the shape of the Australian continent. I'd also like to acknowledge AusMinerals, the Geological Survey of South Australia and Queensland, who've also been collaborative partners in this research. To start this presentation, I'd like to talk about what tectonic analysis is and how potential field and other geophysical data sets can relate to that. Tectonics is really the processes that control the structure and properties of the Earth's crust and its evolution through time. It addresses the 3D architecture, the kinematic constraints and the overprinting relationships, and allows the interpretation of tectonic settings and environments and how this relates to the crustal evolution. Potential field data in particular lends itself to tectonic analysis for several reasons. The first is that it informs information about the crustal structure, and this occurs at different scales, from the mine scale up to the continental scale. For continents like Australia, it has excellent spatial resolution. And the coverage of the data set allows a correlation between the observed geophysical signal and geological observations. The data can be treated to interrogate different crustal levels. And if you apply structural geophysical approaches where we look at the evolution, the kinematics, the architecture, we can use this to make inferences about tectonic settings. One of the advantages of potential field data is that it has excellent petrophysical characteristics that are understood. And so there's an easy conversion between the observed geophysical data and what that might mean in terms of a geological process or a feature. And of course, if you add in geology into the equation, you get much greater confidence in the interpretation that you're getting. The images that you see on the right are from a paper from Johnny Stewart and myself a decade ago, really highlighting the types of approaches that we use in structural geophysics groups to create geological maps to assist geologists, and the interpretation that you see there is of the northwestern portion of the Gawler Craton that covers Archean and Paleoproterozoic rocks. When you think about interpretation of the data, I think it does help to think like a structural geologist. And as a structural geologist, we really address three things. We address geometry, overprinting relationships, and kinematics. And we apply that at different scales, and we use those different multi-scale analysis to come up with a tectonic interpretation. If you add knowledge in, then you can actually start to reduce some of the ambiguity of the data. So what is that knowledge? It can be actual data like petrophysical data and geological observations, but it also includes an understanding of what tectonic features and structural systems look like. And the more information you have and more knowledge that you bring to the interpretation, the greater information that you can pull out of the data set. One of the things that I teach my undergraduate students when we teach geophysical interpretation is the first thing that you need to think about is, what do you want to achieve from an interpretation? Do you want a structure map? Do you want a geological map? Do you just want particular features? Are you just hunting down bumps in the data to target a mineral system, for example? And once you understand what you want to achieve from your interpretation, that's how you formulate your strategy. The images that you see here are really some examples of some geophysical interpretations from my research group. The layers on the top are looking at metamorphic belts in the northern Gawler Craton, and we're interpreting multiple phases of fold generations to produce fold interference patterns, and we can use those patterns to determine the kinematics and movements of rocks. The middle tier of imagery, which has come from Mount Isa Inlier, is really an interpretation of a well-exposed terrain, and we can use the data to inform and provide additional information around the tectonic evolution of a terrain, even though the geology is well exposed. And the last example that you see down is really an example showing a highly deformed granite from the hilt of a granite suite. It's got an asymmetrical shape that's similar to the asymmetry that you see in microstructures such as porphyroblasts, and you can use those sorts of relationships to interpret the kinematics of rocks. When we want to understand the geometry or the architecture of the crust, we often apply three approaches, sometimes in combination. Forward models are essentially a process where we try to understand the geology and construct a cross-section that is constrained by geology, but also constrained by the gravity and magnetic response. So we view it as a process of cross-section construction constrained by three data sets when we can. Inverse modeling is an approach that we use to understand three-dimensional geometry. Often inverse models are constrained by geology constraints, but also other forward modeling elements, and some of the examples that I'll demonstrate later on show this. And then the other element is historical modeling, which we would use to build a three-dimensional model and calculate the geophysical response based on geological knowledge. And the example that you see here is from Cherie Armisted's honours project, where she constructed a fold interference pattern of the North Portia deposit and its related geology, and use that three-dimensional model to calculate and assess the geological history. This slide is showing the simplified workflows that we might undertake to develop a three-dimensional model using geophysical data sets to understand the crustal architecture. We really start from the position of the geological map or a geophysical interpretation, which is represented as a map. We may use forward modeling to help us to construct a skeletal framework to build an explicit 3D model, such as GoCAD, or that map may be an input into more implicit approaches to three-dimensional modeling. We can also use historical modeling, and then from that we really start with an a priori model, which is the first starting point, and then we apply an inverse modeling approach to modify both the rock properties and the geometry, usually sequentially, until we get a satisfactory match and we come up with the final model. It's important to understand that the method that we would use is really based on the problem. And so by understanding the problem, then we make a call on what is the best approach. I'm not going to dwell on this too much because I've already mentioned it, except for to say that our group really has an approach of constructing a cross-section that's geological when we do our forward models. So we end up with profiles that look like the one that's demonstrated in the top right side, which is basically a crustal scale profile in the Western Gawler Craton. It's designed to be a cross-section of the geology, so when a geologist looks at it, and this is kind of the opposite to a more reductionist approach that's often used in geophysical space, which is we're going to use the simplest geometry to create a match between the observed and the calculated geophysical response. Now, both methods are valid and both have their purpose, but from a tectonics analysis approach, the reductionist, sort of the simplified model, doesn't really cut it. So we go with the cross section. To constrain that cross section, we use geology plus, as I said before, the mag and gravity data and any sort of geophysical interpretation. When we apply inverse modeling processes to solving problems, we would really never do an unconstrained model. We always try and start with an a priori model, either constructed through implicit or explicit three-dimensional modeling approaches. In this case, we've got a historical model that Robin Arment built as part of his PhD project in the Mount Painter Inlier, to give you some sense of the differences in the outcomes of it. So this is this feature here is an unconstrained model of this gravity data set, and it basically comes up with, as you would expect, a series of blobs. It's a UBC approach. This is the result of the constrained model, and you can see that they're very different outcomes, and one that's based on geology and represents geology. The other one is essentially a blob that is essentially meaningless for the approach that we wanted to do. Historical modelling is more complicated. I don't encourage it unless you have a good understanding. And the example that I've shown you here is from the same project as the previous slide, which is Robin Arment's PhD project. And he was tasked to build a complicated three-dimensional model based on his understanding of the geology. There's 7 steps here. In reality, there was probably 50 plus steps and subtle fidgeting of the three-dimensional model to get, and the history to get the geometries that were really the starting point of the modeling process. So if you want to go down this pathway, it's a complicated a process where you have to construct a series of geological histories that includes structural geology, sedimentary events, and igneous events, and they all have to be superimposed upon each other until you get the right geometry. And each of the geological histories is defined by a series of kinematic events and a set of orientations and scaling parameters. So this is an approach where you would use it where you have really good understanding of the geology. So why would we care about this stuff? I like to show this slide because it highlights a couple of things, and the first one is that if you look at the distribution of copper mineralization on the planet, it really tells you that it's occurring in the overriding plate of active convergent margins. Most of us know this. We've known it for a long time, but it does provide a context for how you might interpret an ancient plate. So here's the Australian plate. Here's the copper deposits on it from a recent publication out of Geoscience Australia. And the question is, given that we know there's a relationship between plate boundaries and copper deposits, when you look at a map like this, the questions arise: where are the plate boundaries? What are their signals, given that there's pretty limited outcrop? And then once we've identified them, what do we do with them? So the next part of the talk will really address this problem. Same set of questions. Instead of showing a mineralization map, it's actually showing the geology map. And the greens and the yellows in this map, which are vast sections of the Australian continent, are areas where basement geology and the hosts of many of our mineral systems are largely buried. So we need ways to be able to image the geology that's under that. There have been 2 critical investments into geophysical datasets, which I think have fundamentally changed the way that we can view our continent. The first one is the collection of regional potential field data, mainly gravity and aeromagnetic datasets, and the ability through advanced computing in the last 25 years to be able to stitch individual surveys together to give us a holistic view of the Australian continent. And of course, when you view this data set as presented here, you can see a series of significant crustal elements about the related to the continent, but of course you can zoom in into a specific area and pick out scales of structures that are significantly more detailed and higher resolution, that tells you about the specific evolution of the Australian continent. The other data set is the collection of regional seismic reflection profiles. that have now been collected extensively across the continent. These data sets provide us with some real detailed constraints about the architecture in cross-sectional view. Here's an interpretation of from John Stewart in his PhD of the crustal architecture of the eastern part of the Gawler Craton on a seismic profile that extends across through the eastern Gawler Craton through here. And you can see that the level of detail that you can get from this data is quite impressive. Here's another one through the Curnamona Province and the northern Arunta Inlier. And this is the work from Bruce Golby, this interpretation in the south here. And what you can see is that there's some dominantly the North Australian Craton with southward dipping reflectors, and then there's a transition zone, and then you come into the Aileron Province and there's some northern dipping reflectors. This is the position of the profile. Here's a forward model of the gravity and the magnetics of that profile, and you can see a significant suture zone that separates the Aileron Province and more dense rocks of the Aileron Province here in the south compared to the more less dense rocks of the Curnamona Province in the north. Here's another seismic reflection profile. This one extends from the northeast Queensland right across into the Mount Isa Inlier in northwest Queensland. The data is really impressive. It actually shows combinations of major suture zones which separate different geological provinces. There's one called the Gidja suture zone here, which likely records a collisional event between this crustal element here and the Mount Isa terrane between somewhere between 1740 and 1710 million years. There's also a thing called the Roe fossil subduction zone, which actually is recorded in below the Moho, and that records a separate and younger collisional event. The Etheridge Province is through here, and the Mount Isa Province is here. And interestingly, this particular profile tells us about how the growth of the continent occurred outboard of the eastern margin of the Proterozoic Australian plate, but it was also inspired and is used as a series of constraints that has allowed for scientists to ask additional questions about the evolution of this plate. So not only does this data provide us with constraints about the evolution of the particular crust, but it also allows the geoscience community to ask new questions and undertake different research results. So they're the various elements and the crustal elements that are associated with the evolution of that plate, and the research has really shown that there is fundamentally different crustal elements related to this part of. This is a forward model of that seismic profile across the Gidja suture zone, which is this zone here represented in black. It is responsible for this steep gravity gradient, which suggests that this suture zone is nearly exposed at the surface of the crust. It is actually transected by the Soldier's Cap group, which has been well dated between 1710 and 1650 million years. So we know that this suture zone must be older than that. We believe that the Chalcodone-Leichhardt belt, which is a series of granitic and granodioritic batholiths that extends along this regional zone through here, is probably the arc or the back arc region to this subduction zone. It's been dated at 1850. In addition to that, we can understand other elements of the history, and I want to use this one as an example. So this is Tegan Blakey's interpretation of the Leichhardt River fault trough, and the key element to watch is this big regional fold through here, which has previously been interpreted to be part of the Isa orogeny, which is a 1600 to 1500 event. And this area is particularly well exposed. But interestingly, when you look at the geophysics, what you'd see is a clear overprint of these weakly magnetic zones that are overprinting the limbs of this fold. And these are filled with basins, phases, that are older than the Isa orogeny. And what this suggests is that this regional fold here predates these basins, which are comprise stratigraphy of the Calvert and Isa superbasin. That tells you fundamental relationship, and from that we were able to identify a major inversion event which we call the Leichhardt event. So I've shown both regional potential field data and also seismic reflection data, and individual examples where we've been able to recognize major plate scale and major crustal penetrating features that tell us something about the history. But when we try to map that out on the present day continent, we see some problems. So this is the work from Russell Korsch and Dublair from Geoscience Australia, using their best interpretations of where these major crustal features are. And what you see is a pattern that looks nothing like plate tectonics. That provides major hints about what has happened to the craton. The current day architecture is not consistent with plate tectonic elements, so we need to consider that. This is their interpretation. This is mine for a particular period, and you can see there's various suture zones and orientations that have been identified in these data sets. This is the Tanami profile here. That's that boundary that I showed earlier. That boundary is imaged further to the southeast. There's the Gawler boundaries and the various crustal elements, and this is the Gidja suture there. You can see that some of them look linear and kind of connect, and others are quite dismembered. And so we need to apply some geological knowledge to help unravel this problem. So Robert and I and some of our colleagues decided to have a look at that and to see how we could do that. So we applied some geological knowledge and some concepts that had previously been applied and tried to understand if we could connect the various suture zones in a particular way. And so we started with a map that looked like this with all these disconnected maps, and then when we unfolded and unwrapped the South Australian Craton and translated it up towards the Isa block and rotated it, we actually created a map that looks much more like one that you would expect in plate tectonics. And so this is a map of essentially the growth of Australia during the assembly of the Nuna supercontinent. And what you can see is that it's a series of ribbon terrains that are actually accreted onto the margin at between 1880 and 1600. There's really two phases of that. There's that occurred on the southern margin, and that's stage one or pre-1710, and then stage two, which is sort of post-1640, and a series of accretionary events on this side. This is, of course, backed up with geological information, and so there's long been a recognition that the geology of the Curnamona Province has similarities to the Mount Isa terrain. We use some of those relationships. Similarly, the isotopic evidence from the Northern Gawler is very similar to the data from the Aileron Province, and so we were able to identify various elements that were connected, and that was used to constrain this interpretation. In the previous slides, we really have addressed the tectonic analysis from an architectural approach. But one of the elements that we need to consider when we do tectonic analysis is the kinematics, and that is really how the rocks have moved. This has really been the domain of structural geologists in the past, and they've used a series of criteria, which is demonstrated in this slide. I'm not going to go into any sort of detail about the significance and meaning of these, except for these criteria are usually undertaken at smaller scales than what geophysical data is collected at. So we typically use thin section microstructures and or mesoscale features in rocks to help us understand the movements of rocks. And here's a list of things that we might use, such as porphyroclast morphology, SC fabrics, microfiche, radial shear zones, asymmetrical fold trains, and foliation deflections. So as a structural geologist, I might walk up to a rock and I might see a relationship, and then I can interpret that. But of course, that's very different to what you can achieve in geophysical data sets. So this slide's really designed, and again, I'm not going to go into details, is really designed to show the features that you would understand and the processes related to a structural geology approach and the scales. And this slide addresses the types of observations that you might make in structural geophysics, so at geophysical scales. So the take-home message from this slide is really that the geological patterns and the kinematic criteria look very similar in structural geology and geophysics. The processes can be very different in the way they form, but nevertheless, you can use those patterns to come up with the same interpretations. Okay, so from a scale perspective, for example, we might use a foliation in a rock to understand the kinematics, and of course, we would never be able to image that. But the kinematics for both of these processes is largely driven by an understanding of the flow patterns of rocks with different rheologies and how rigid blocks would buffer flow around rocks that flow. Okay, and this is one of the key observations and things that we learn is that we can look at these data sets, and I'm going to show you some in a minute, to interpret kinematics. So here's an example from the Gawler Craton. It's a first vertical derivative image, and what you can see is some shear zones that have, or some fault zones that have a low magnetic response, and you can see asymmetrical patterns in the rocks that are in between, and they could be a gneissic layering or a dike or something like that, and the pattern that you can see demonstrates the kinematics. It look very similar to SC shear bands in a rock. The processes by which these patterns form are very different, but you can interpret them the same way. Here's another example. Here's an asymmetrical porphyroclast here in a shear zone, and here is a granite with the almost identical patterns. And whilst the processes in which these deformations occur are very different, the patterns can be still interpreted the same way. So when the structural geologist would look at this pattern and say this is a dextral or right lateral shear zone in the view that we're looking at, you would also be able to use the shape of this granite to interpret the same response. Interestingly enough, this shear zone, which is called the Yerta shear zone, is exposed, and when we look at that exposure, it yields dextral movement sense as well. Again, we have two plutons here with defined contact aureoles, but at the edges of those plutons, you can see tails that also are consistent with dextral scale movement, and this would be analogous to a strain shadow in a deforming porphyroclast in a shear zone. So what do we learn from the regional geophysics? Basically, in terms of kinematics, you can use these data sets to understand large-scale movements of rocks. Okay, and one of the advantages of doing it at the scale of the geophysical data sets that we look at is it really is telling you the bulk scale of the movement. Many of the geometrical criteria that we use to understand rock kinematics at the microscale can be applied at regional geophysical data sets. we basically rely on looking at planar features and how they flow around that. Of course, you need to have data sets that have a magnetic signal, and so that you can get those planar features. But those planar features can be a combination of bedding, existing shear zones and or dikes, as long as there's some sort of contrast and planar feature that you can affect. Of course, when you do a kinematic analysis, as the ones I show, the criteria that is most effective at assisting in interpreting strike slip faults. And of course, from a mineral systems perspective, if we understand what the kinematics are, then we can do things like predict dilation sites and therefore fluid flow, which might be useful in targeting mineral systems. In the second part of this presentation, I'd like to give a couple of case studies. The first one will be related to the Mount Woods Inlier, which is located in the northern Gawler Craton. This is a poorly exposed region. It has excellent geophysical data sets because of exploration by Oz Minerals, and it's significant because this part of the northern Gawler Craton hosts the prominent hill IOCG deposit. So here's some results from a previous study, and I'll give you a massive hint. It's my honours work from the early 1990s with BHP Billiton. And the data set that we were interpreting at the time was basically 400 metre spaced regional data set with a 100 metre grid. The basis for the interpretation and was essentially identification of major features in this data. You can see the limited outcrop is really restricted to this part of the world of the inlier through here, and there's some smaller outcrops here, and there was some mapping that was done in some of these outcrops, and then the interpretation was used as a basis to construct these Ford models. So one of the Ford models which is presented here is profile C, which is the one that extends through here, and you can see that the Ford modeling is really of the magnetics, and it was modeling steep structures. And the other one is a model through this region here, which basically identified this structure through here, which is the panorama fault, and it was a steeply west dipping structure. At the time of this interpretation, there was almost no geochronology and no context to interpret the rocks except for the rock types from the rare outcrops that were exposed. So this is just a map showing the more higher resolution data that was collected by Oz Minerals. This is 50 metre spaced data with a 12 metre grid, and superimposed on the image, which is the first vertical derivative image, is basically the distribution of the outcrops. Now, the outcrops are not important, except for to say that we're really working with quite limited geological constraints when we're doing this. Okay, but the data that we had allowed for a higher resolution geophysical interpretation, and in addition to this, we had much greater geochronological resolution, courtesy of Geological Survey South Australia and some work from Caroline Tiddy and Oz Minerals. So to give you some sense of what the rock types look like, that's what an exposure looks like. It's basically vast, flat-lying desert with sporadic outcrops sticking out. This is a gneissic layer in the showing what a typical rock would look like, and further to the south there's some drilling, and this is a younger package of rocks that is obviously less metamorphosed and less deformed. So that's basically what we're working with. This is an overview of the geological history. These are the older rocks here. The basement upon which the Mount Woods Inlier formed is basically the Archean component of the Gawler Craton, which is the Mulgathing and Christie domains. Then there's a series of sedimentary packages that were kind of deposited somewhere between 1900 and 1700 and deformed during the Kimberlin orogeny. And then a second phase of sedimentation and significant igneous activities related to what we call the Hilterber event, and then that was overprinted by the Corona orogeny. So that's some sort of geological knowledge that we could take into the equation. There's basically zones of high-grade metamorphism and relatively low-grade metamorphism, and the terrain is extensively intruded by Hilterber sweep, mafic, and granitic rocks as well. This is the data. It's spectacular. This is the reduction to the pole data with a linear lookup table. But once you start processing it, you really start to see incredible amounts of detailed geology. This is a first vertical derivative grayscale image. This is a second vertical derivative grayscale image with the gravity data, residual gravity data superimposed. And if we zoom in into an area just surrounding Prominent Hill, you can see enormous amounts of detail, not only in terms of different rock packages, but also significant structural features. You can see impressive shear zones here, folded stratigraphic packages that are doubly plunging through here. These are essentially mafic rock suites that are related to the Hilterber suite, and some of these ones here are related to the felsic packages. So there's an enormous wealth of information that can be gleaned from this. So I'm going to give you the summary of the additional information that's also supplied in this analysis to come up with the final interpretation, and that is the geochronological constraints. We understand there's a metamorphic event at 1735, an igneous event at 1690, and there was a period of sedimentation that's largely recorded down the southern side of the Inlier, and then we have constraints on the igneous activity that's related to the Hilterber event, and then post the Hilterber event we have argon ages that tell us information about the cooling. And of course that provided a context to help us interpret other elements of that. And some of that data has been gleaned from outcrops, and others have been gleaned from drill hole data that's related to the exploration. So I'm going to cut to the interpretation first so that you can see it, and the interpretation is really basically quite simple. We think that this interpretation is the tectonic regime of the Mount Woods Inlier has all the hallmarks of a metamorphic core complex. And what that really is a great big domal feature of basement rocks that have been exhumed during hyperextension, and the peripheral margins of that dome is indeed the upper plate and undergoing brittle extensional deformation features. Interestingly, if this interpretation is indeed correct, it's probably one of the oldest identified metamorphic core complexes on Earth. So here's the interpretation. You can see there's lots of detail. I don't want to go into any of the major elements of it, except for to illustrate some key points. So this yellow zone through here is something we call the central domain, and it is basically a domain of highly deformed, poly-deformed, multiple phases of folding, isoclinal folding, fold interference patterns that suggest nap tectonics, and highly deformed rocks in rocks that are also high metamorphic grade. And then on this side of this structure, which we call the skylark fault, the deformation style changes significantly. There are folds in the rocks, but the dominant phase of deformation in this phase is dominated by linear features that overprint the Hilterber granites, and they tend to have evidence for normal offset, and I'll show you some of that evidence in a minute. So we have ductile rocks to the north, and then more brittle rocks to the south. So that's the first observation. We look at the lower plate in detail. you can see all sorts of interesting features. But basically, you can see if you follow the truncations of the metamorphic layering, you can actually map out highly contorted reverse faults and etc. in the data. You can see patterns that are reminiscent of type 2 fold interferences, which require naps or recumbent folds to be overprinted by upright folds. And you can see in the regional interpretation evidence for lots of faults. Here's some more examples here, which is some folding that exists in the southwest corner of the central domain, which is interpreted as the lower plate. And you can see in the folds that have been mapped out in detail that are related to geophysical anomalies, and these are interpreted to be basically parts of stratigraphy. Now, you might recall from the earlier earlier interpretation from my honours year that this structure here was a steep structure. This is a skylark shear zone. When I was out there with a colleague of mine, John Stewart, we stumbled across an outcrop that changed the way we viewed the interpretation. And this is an important observation and shows why geological knowledge is significant. And what we discovered was that the skylark shear zone was not a steep structure at all. It was actually really shallowly dipping to the south, and it had kinematic indicators on it, which suggested that it was a normal fault. And that changed everything. It really meant that we had something real and geological that we could be used to understand this structure here, which is a skylark shear zone. And what it said was that this was the hanging wall of the structure, and this was indeed the footwall. When we look at the upper plate, so the hanging wall structure, we see a pattern, one that is dominated by normal fault activity. Now, some of these interpretations are based on orientation, but there is clear evidence in some parts of the overriding plate that the tectonic setting is and the faults are indeed normal faults. So if we zoom into here, what you can see is packages of rocks that are actually thickening towards these oriented structures. And you can see that in the interpretation here, where this yellow unit here is actually thickening, and that would be a strong indicator for extensional half-graben style deformation. Now, there's clearly some strike slip element of this fault, so it's an oblique normal fault. But that pattern, where these northwest oriented faults are really high density distributions in this sort of hanging wall of this skylark shear zone. The other thing about the skylark shear zone is that it actually is highly arcuate. So not only is it a linear feature there, but it actually bends around like you would expect for a dome, and then it gets truncated and offset in these places. But this is a feature that you would also expect from a metamorphic complex. So here's a zoom in on those normal faults as I showed before, and you can see these low magnetic packages here showing quite growth geometries up against these normal faults, and that was used to constrain and interpret normal faulting. And the timing of that normal faulting is post-dating the Hilterberg granites. So there actually is a clear overprinting relationship that tells us about the timing of that normal fault activity. This is a summary of the major structural elements associated with the Mount Woods Inlier. You can see the lower plate is dominated by highly arcuate and structural features that represent a ductile deformation regime, and overprinting that is a series of brittle scale normal faults that I've demonstrated, but also overprinting those are these orange features that formed during the Curnamona orogeny, and that's the last phase of deformation that affected the Mount Woods Inlier. It's rather significant because in this region in here, these thrust faults and reverse faults that formed during the Curnamona orogeny overprint the Prominent Hill IOCG deposit. So what did we learn by comparing the interpretation from using an older data set compared to the new interpretation? Well, I guess there's 2 points that are significant. Firstly, we were able to glean much more information from the 12-metre grid versus the 100-metre grid. And in addition to that, the interpretation became much more sophisticated, not only because of the better geophysical data set that we were using, but also the additional knowledge-based information, that being high resolution mapping of the limited outcrop as well as the geochronology data set. There certainly was an element of luck by virtue of walking up to the outcrops of the Skylark shear zone and understanding that this thing was a shallow dipping normal fault rather than a steep dipping structure as had previously been assumed. The overprinting relationships allow us to determine the timing of the core complex, and that is the structures in the overriding plate or the upper plate are basically overprinting the Hilterberg igneous event, meaning that this extensional event either is synchronous with or occurred immediately afterwards. Importantly, you could not resolve the history and or the architecture of the Mount Woods Inlier by looking at the outcrops alone, and I would argue that you probably wouldn't be able to interpret the metamorphic core complex without key geological constraints. And if we step it out at a level and compare it with the evolution of the similar structures during the evolution of the Gawler Craton, you can see the Mount Woods Inlier is situated here, and it actually forms part of a larger extensional event. This is an interpretation of Craton scale structures at the same time that formed during a roughly east, northeast, west, southwest extensional event that's responsible for the activity of this series of bird's foot splays off this master Yerta shear zone, which we've talked about previously. It's interesting that the IOCGs at this scale appear to be isolated and controlled by the intersection of these late Hilterberg, post-Hilterberg granite shear zones and where they intersect this ancient suture zone around the edges of the Gawler Craton. The second case study I want to talk about is the Mount Painter Inlier, which temporarily overlaps with the Mount Woods Inlier in terms of its evolutionary aspects and deformation history. The Proterozoic elements of the Mount Painter Inlier are localised in the northern Curnamona Province, positioned up here where this yellow star is, and it's a northeast trending belt of Proterozoic rocks that were deposited at the start of the Mesoproterozoic. The geophysical data sets are okay. They're relatively high resolution magnetic data sets that provide information about the distribution of major rock packages, as well as gravity data, which is characterized by this low zone in the southern part, and this becomes important in the interpretation, and rocks to the east and west. To the west of the Mount Painter Inlier is Neoproterozoic rocks of the Adelaide Geosyncline and the northern Flinders Ranges. So this slide really summarises some of the input data that we use to determine the structural architecture and the tectonic evolution. As I pointed out before, this is a historically built model that's built on the history of Rob and Armit's understanding of the region, and this model is required numerous iterations to come up with the response, and this formed the a priori model that will be used during inversion. This slide here represents the complex workflow that Robin undertook to achieve the final three-dimensional model, and in his tectonic analysis. the basis of it was, and the starting point was synthesizing all the geological knowledge related to the area, and that included significant amounts of field campaign by Robin in the field undertaking mapping and metamorphic analysis, etc. He then created the NODI model, which was then imported into GoCAD, and that formed the a priori model, which started a series of constrained inversions using VPMG as the framework. And so essentially the process thereafter involved iterative steps of inverting for geometry and comparing it with the observed data, and then inverting for petrophysical properties. And that process of inverting geometry and inverting for petrophysical properties in sequence was done multiple times until there was a satisfied fit for that between the observed and the calculated data. It was relatively easy to get a fit for the magnetics, because the magnetics was largely controlled by the geophysical response. Getting a fit for the inversions for the gravity response was much more difficult. And you can see here that there was a significant variation between that the original gravity response and that from the residual gravity response after sequential combinations of inversions occurred. So that was telling us that there was some fundamental problem with the original a priori model. So this is demonstrated here. This is the observed gravity. This is the calculated response. They're not the same. And so Robin went back to the drawing board and said, well, if my initial concept of what was causing the anomaly is not correct, is my a priori model wrong? And so he went back to the original model and added an additional element, which was a large granitic body into the model, and by adding that body into it, he was able to create an inverse product that essentially had a much better fit between the gravity and the magnetic response. I guess that the point of this slide is to demonstrate that if you can't get a fit by your geological knowledge, sometimes you have to assess, is your knowledge that you've applied to it actually valid, or is there alternative solutions to the problem? I should also point out that Robin not only did one model, but he did multiple models testing the hypothesis about how to best match the gravity response. Interestingly enough, what it essentially shown was that the Empire granite, which is an Ordovician granite that is exposed in the southern part of the Mount Painter Inlier, probably has a much larger extent in the subsurface, and that was the major interpretation from that inverse modelling. So in summary for this one, quantitative information was gleaned from the data, and the process involved basically the construction of multiple models after the initial a priori model was constructed and then tested, and the sensitivities and the uncertainties of the models were assessed in sequence. And that led to the process of where one or more of the models were actually rejected in favour of a particular model or three-dimensional model. Interestingly, the recognition of geometries in the subsurface, and it's demonstrated in these two block 3D models there, were not consistent with the surface geology, and that was because the granite that's largely controlling the gravity response was not exposed at the surface. So when the initial model was built on geological constraints, there was no hint that there was a granite in the geological expression of the region. There's more than just matching the signal. In this case, we actually had to follow rules of geology. So the three-dimensional model that eventually was created is actually self-consistent with the geological history that is understood from knowledge-based analysis, as well as the signal from the gravity and the magnetic response. And so everything had to be internally self-consistent, including the understanding of the geological history of the. On that note, I might finish up the presentation and open up the floor for questions. Thank you.